Okay, hey everyone, welcome to sorry, I forgot where we are. Another cover seminar. We're not doing a podcast. Um, the final cover seminar of 2024, if I remember correctly. Um, and for this day, we are joined by the excellent Anna Minozzo and her wonderful friend Santina, who you will see in a second. But Anna does really excellent stuff in terms of working in sort of, let's say, community-oriented psychoanalysis and does really interesting theoretical work. So I thought, particularly given that she wrote a book about anxiety, and if there's one emotion that seems to currently summarize working at Essex, it might be anxiety. So it seemed like a fitting moment to have an event with you in a chat. So with that being the intro, I'm going to turn the laptop this way and hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Some old friends and some new friends. Good afternoon. So thanks so much, Stephen, for welcoming me in this cover seminar today. We are going to discuss the work that I've done in this book here, Anxiety as Vibration, which is available as an open access book. So if you Google it, you can download it for free. I'm not going to explain the book in detail because you can just read it. But what I'll do is just about some of its ideas.
I'm listening to this.
Some of its ideas, and try and bring it towards the end to the point of the cover seminars and people's interests. So I'll speak for a little bit and then hopefully we can have a conversation. So to begin with, I'd like you to think with me of these two scenes or these two realities. That's where I began to wonder where we're at. So the first scene is that according to several pieces of research both in the US and in the UK, it's estimated that 20% of the population at least is pathologically anxious, whatever that means. So pathologically, so that you would fill the criteria to have a diagnosis that requires some sort of, medical care for your anxiety. So something about your anxiety is too much. It's not normal. It's pathological. There is not similar data in other countries, but if we follow other kinds of indicators, it seems to be a Western reality that 20% of the population at least should be pathologically anxious. What is available? I don't know if that's your experience, but what is available if you have pathological anxiety or diagnosed anxiety? Well, in the UK, you can go and see the NICE guidelines, which are the guidelines for care. And the main two things that are available for people are medication. Mostly they're antidepressants. And the name is funny because for anxiety, take an antidepressant. But yes, since the 90s, 2000s, that's what you take for anxiety. And they are mostly, Ariana, I just saw your message. Yeah, we can share the link later, definitely. And these pills are mostly prescribed in primary care, which means your GP. And as you know, a lot of times you don't even see the GP and you already get a prescription. So a lot of this anxiety and depression medications, they're not even given at secondary care. So specialist mental health services. Primary care straight away. And the other thing that is considered, excellent care in the UK is CBT, either through apps that the NHS will give to you or 6 sessions of CBT through the iApt service. In other countries, the medical paradigm seems to be similar in the sense that the rise of medicalization of anxiety is exponential in the last few years. I think that's horrible. I think that's not enough in terms of care, because you're really taking this anxiety, this affect, because in psychoanalysis, we think of anxiety not as a disorder, but an affect. You're taking that affect, and all you're doing is to quiet it down. And there's two alternatives: to stop feeling it, rather than asking any questions about it. Questions, for example, about the function of this affect or this experience that you have. So what is this telling you? So you're anxious about what? What's been going on? The basic. So one other way to think about anxiety is through psychoanalytic lenses. Well, psychoanalysis, in general terms, works exactly with what doesn't fit. Something doesn't seem right, and you don't really know what that's about. In this sense, it challenges a lot of this medical paradigm of thinking about the stress and what's pathological and what's not. And yet, psychoanalysis, and that's leaving alone our ideas about what it means. And my colleague Lygia is here in the room today as well. We have a group research at the University of Essex that's called Free Psy, about the history and legacies of free psychoanalytic clinics, just to throw it out there. So psychoanalysis, even though it's become this elitist, bourgeois kind of practice, has a more radical history, and we've got lots to say about it. But in general terms, psychoanalysis works exactly with what doesn't fit and what we don't know, with this opacity of ourselves in our experience. And yet, in diverse orientations, because psychoanalysis is not one thing, it starts with Freud, but then it has different orientations that don't really agree on everything and sometimes disagree in most things. But one thing that is common is that all the psychoanalytic orientations have some sort of frame or a metapsychological model to understand subjectivity. So what is it that operates between your conscious experience and your unconscious experiences, and the life that you lead, and how you've been brought up, and what are the possibilities for you to navigate the world? That involves a certain framing of your experience. So when thinking about, okay, someone is really anxious, if 20% of the population is anxious, then, and if we don't want to just give sertraline or give 6 sessions of CBT, and we want to ask, okay, what is actually going on? We can think with psychoanalysis. But is psychoanalysis enough? Has it been doing enough for those people that come and say that they feel anxious, which is the majority of people, actually? As most of you probably know, and infamously, psychoanalysis, since Freud already, operates with a metaphor for how our desiring life unfolds. And that is through the Oedipal metaphor. So Oedipus, as you know, it's a Greek story that Freud picks up to make an analogy about how infants grow up in the family, and how, in the words of Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze, how there is a modulation of desire and subjectivity through that family unit. So these are 2 things. And then you think, okay, so psychoanalysis allows us to ask something else about what doesn't seem quite right in our experience. And yet it comes with this frame. So how much of an alternative is this? How is this enough? So in this research that I conducted, I started in 2016 and finished in 2021, but the book just came out this year. What I was able to map is that in psychoanalytic theory, across different orientations, anxiety is an experience of excess. There's something excessive of me in me. There's some libidinal energy, which is this kind of bodily / psychic flow that fuels our life. So the life energy in Freud's is the energy of Eros. that of life for Freud. There's something excessive of that is mobilized as the source of anxiety. And if we see in the different orientations of psychoanalysis, we could think of kind of two strengths, to be very basic about it. So one type of psychoanalysis, especially the British school, and what goes on to be developed in the US, which really kind of snobbish psychoanalysts in the continent don't even think it's psychoanalysis, but that's called ego psychology. This, kind of Second World War, post kind of refugee Jewish and lefty analysts that went to the US and the British school. So the Anglo psychoanalysis, in general lines, of course, there are exceptions. There is a work that tries and strengthen your ego. The ego is the Latinized word for the I. Freud says ich, it's me. That's all. There's not anything crazier than that. It's just me. So strengthening this me makes me more capable of handling this wave of excess. And then you have this other strand of psychoanalysis that thinks that this me, the ego, it's already a bit complicated. Maybe it's something that we shouldn't rely so much upon. And maybe it's about making it not stronger, but more porous, more malleable. So it actually flows with the waves rather than, like stronger. For this reason, because I thought that there was something about excess that I don't want to be strong in relation to when it comes to anxiety, that in this work, I chose to work with Freud and Lacan, because those are the main theorists that allows us to think about this porosity of the me, yeah? But the question was, okay, if anxiety across the board in psychoanalysis is understood as an excessive experience, could we then not just ask, okay, what is this anxiety about? What's going on? But could that also do something else? If it's hitting some sort of idea of me that is unsustainable, could this excess then be the fuel for a different way of living? And in order to answer this question, it was necessary that I tried to forge a feminist alternative to the clinic of anxiety. There was no way to think about this excess of me in me if not through a feminist lenses. And that, of course, it came up because, I was already a feminist researcher. But the more I dug into the text, getting all this like Freud and Lacan texts, using them as archives, just going through them in detail, the clearer it got. And you see why in a minute. So to begin with anxiety, as which I'm sure everyone has experienced, and I think if you haven't, then that would be more worrisome. Anxiety is not something new. If you look at like medical texts, there's evidence of what is described as anxiety already in the 18th century. And anxiety would be part of things that are objective and subjective. Objective in psychiatry because it's to do with the body. So usually it's digestion and breathing. And if you've ever felt anxious, you know that that's where it hits, And it's so interesting. It's breathing and digesting, those things that sustain life. And there's something that affects, this parts of the body that really sustain life when we are anxious. And the subjective would be the thoughts, the racing thoughts, the repetition, the something to do with time. And yet, if you look at all the psychiatric history of anxiety, it doesn't show anxiety as a problem in itself. It's not an illness. It's not a disease. It's not a disorder like it's known now. It's an aspect of life that, yes, can be too much, in some cases, and it can be a component of, until the 19th century was madness. But it wasn't the problem. There was, something else. There was another umbrella of experiences that anxiety was a part of. And this is really key because that's exactly what's going to change in the 20th century and how much that changes our own possibility of being anxious. And again, it's not that being anxious is fun or cool, but it is an effect of excess. And what happens if our possibility of experiencing excess is modulated in a way that we are not able to experience any excess? My theory was that we become even more anxious, and more subjective to that which promises a cure for it. And of course, if you think about hegemonic psychiatry, we're talking about big pharma, we're talking about a specific psychopolitical landscape that doesn't account for any kind of emancipation through that which the body is producing. And again, this is such a feminist issue, isn't it? There is a tradition of feminist scholars that have worked with this idea that symptoms from hysteria, for instance, in the 19th century, they were a form of social protest. So it's not that whatever the body produces is meaningless. It's not fun. It's not great. And yet it's sometimes a way of addressing. The history of anxiety shifts dramatically in the late 19th century. What happens is that in psychiatry, you have, in neurology mainly, you have this discovery of what's now the nervous system. At the time was the ganglionar system that was called, and the popularization of this diagnosis that was called neurasthenia. And that was something that mostly women, of course, were diagnosed with. And it was seen as a weakness of the nerves. And so they were, given rest cures, cold baths, all those kinds of things. Oh, no, woman, you're thinking too much. Stop thinking and you won't suffer. That kind of thing. And this is exactly the period, the late 19th century, when Freud comes into the picture. And one of his first pieces of writing, before psychoanalysis was actually structured as it is, we understand psychoanalysis to begin in the publication of this book called Interpretation of Dreams, which is 1900. And before, there is like a load of letters that Freud exchanged with some doctor friends mostly, and texts that he wrote, and some of them are pretty mad, but pretty cool. And usually we refer to them as pre-psychoanalytic texts. That's really cool because you know what? If you like Guattari, he goes there. Guattari spends years, on psychoanalysis, saying that psychoanalysis got so much wrong. And towards the end of his works, he goes back to early Freud. So it's quite, I think that's a really beautiful movement of rescuing something radical in early Freud. So Freud writes one of his first pre-psychoanalytic texts already, differentiating neurasthenia to what he calls anxious or anxiety neurosis. There's something about anxiety that is at the foundation of psychoanalysis already. And of course, Freud, being Freud, he links anxiety to the sexual. And again, if you read Freud, and no excuses, he's talking about sex, he's talking about heteropatriarchal sex. And yet, he's not. Over and over again, he's talking about the dimension of the sexual as something beyond just sex, but the dimension of enjoyment, of investment of the potency of life and death. Yeah. So that's one way of reading, especially those early texts. There's something about this somatic energy that he's talking about. And anxiety, the whole theorization of anxiety is trying and figure out this threshold of soma and psyche. What happens when there's an excitation that is from within and one that is from without? In and out. Are there different anxieties? And Freud changes his mind 1 billion times. So now I won't go through that, but I did in the book. You can read, and it's short, so it's, it's going to save you some time. But he changes his mind across his life. So until he dies in the 30s, he will come up with different theories, as you know, and he contradicts himself 1 billion times, which I love about Freud. I think it's a position of non-mastery if you can doubt yourself. So psychoanalysis, as we know, was very, even though it wasn't hegemonic as such in the beginning of the 20th century, it had a bit more power in mainstream psychiatry. So if you have the first, especially the first versions of what is now the DSM, so the manual, the psychiatric manual from the US, which unfortunately is the language that we use everywhere in the world, even though it's an American manual, you know, it's got nothing to do with other parts of the world, but it has hegemonic power. It's not what clinicians use to fill out forms, but it's what they often in other parts of the world use to think about what's going on in the encounter. You know, you use the ICD of the World Health Organization, so the International Catalog of Diseases, which is really important. So if you have like a pandemic, to know what we are working with. But in mental health, you use an ICD code in bureaucracy, and you use a DSM grammar in the clinic, which is something that people have written about. So the first versions of the DSM, so until the 60s, we have 2 DSM issues published. They were thin, and they work more or less with psychodynamic ideas. So the idea that there is an unconscious, that whatever experience you have is part of a whole picture. And you have more or less this division between neurosis and psychosis, which is very psychoanalytic too. But things will change dramatically in the mid-20th century. Well, now, as you know, psychiatry and the psychologists, they have a beef with being too esoteric or too humanities-like and not hard sciences. And in the 70s, this group of American psychiatrists, they want to make psychiatry medical and scientific again. So nothing that is not objective. And they create a new paradigm for the DSM that is based on checklists. That, you know, takes all the psychoanalytic influence out of the manual. And that is published in 1980. So it's created in the 70s. And again, if we think about, you know, other political events around that time, you know, the rise of neoliberal politics, a type of financial human capital that emerges too, it all kind of goes together, you know, so it's not in isolation. It informs one another, kind of psychopolitics of the thing. And then what happens is that...
Which DSM?
This is DSM-3. This is like the big change in paradigm. This is when things really change. And you know, what's interesting is that it's not like bad, you know. What they claim was that a lot of the earlier versions of the manuals relied too much on the interpretation of the doctor. And as you know, doctors were not very kind to people in mental health. And so that would take, in theory, power away from this doctor of deciding and make things more objective. And that, you think, is a benevolent effort, no? Like, you don't want a psychiatrist to say no, yes, based on nothing. If there's something that could be agreed, great. And yet, what happens then in relation to anxiety is so important. And when I was researching that, I was like, what happens is, at the same time, in the 50s, you start a lot of new experimentations with psychiatric drugs. And you start in the 50s, actually, one of the first like tricyclic, one of the first antidepressants ever, those heavy ones that made people really feel heavy, were already being used to think about anxiety and panic attacks. So if you can look at the trials. And this establishes this paradigm of the drug. So the diagnosis is not given and then there's a drug for it. There's a drug, and by giving the drug and seeing how the drug operates, you create a diagnosis. And this is crazy. Our colleague, Felicity Collard, that some of you might have heard of, she used to be at Birkbeck when I was there. She has a really cool article in this first trials in the 50s. I mentioned it in the book. It's, yeah, it's curious, you know. But then it installs this drug paradigm that drugs tests are then the first point of understanding what an experience is, which, yeah, not great when making those drugs is part of a multi-billion, you know, effort, multi-billion profit effort. What happens in DSM-3 is that you have the checklists, and then anxiety, until then, was in the 20th century was very common in the clinic, especially, you know, after the First World War and the rise of psychoanalysis for outpatient care. You have a lot of anxious people. There's a lot of text, you know, the age of anxiety, this idea of, you know, fast lives now, we're anxious. It's the speed, you know, of modern life that makes you anxious. Whilst it was considered kind of widespread and common, the number of diagnoses of anxiety was really high, but you didn't have the same kind of treatments available, and it wasn't a disorder on its own. It appeared in the first two DSMs as, you know, as this kind of neurotic umbrella term, but in the DSM-3, it's separated. You have generalized anxiety disorder, which still is in the DSM, and then you have all these other categories. And you could only have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder if your anxiety wasn't about social separation, if it wasn't about social anxiety, if it wasn't panic, if it wasn't this, da, 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 da. But then there is the introduction of depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, MDD. That's new in the DSM-3. And now it's curious because depression until then, it wasn't something very common in outpatient care. Mostly it was something that was seen in hospitals because it was connected to melancholia, to those really extreme states, you know, when you really lose all the will for life. So depression wasn't in the vocabulary of us understanding our experiences as such. But with the publication of the DSM-3, what do you see? And if you look at the statistics, all in different countries, I look at France, the US, the UK, and Brazil mostly, because that's like where I kind of circulate in my mind. But, you know, would be curious to see other places too. The shift is like this, whilst like, I don't know it by heart, but it's something like depression would be like a fifth of the number of anxiety diagnoses in a year. It changes after the DSM-3. So this changes in the checklist actually produce a different phenomenon, a different reality. And I find that very curious. And I would be curious about all sorts of other, you know, diagnoses. I think some people think about that with PTSD, with the personality disorders, and all kinds of things. What are the impacts of giving something a name and making that name easier to be kind of a label? What happens to how we can experience that state? And in the case of anxiety, it's curious because then the diagnosis of anxiety go like this, from one decade to the other. And then you have some books that try and like make sense of it. The rise of the depressive subject. You know, you have like Time magazine, depression is gonna kill more people than heart attacks, whatever, in the USA. Or like, oh, it's like what's costing the country more than whatever else. But it's interesting to think that a lot of those studies, they think about, you know, social conditions, but they forget that there is actually this idea of naming an effect that is quite key there. And then what's really curious is that, okay, the drugs are going to carry on. And then you have in the mid-20th century, the rise of the benzos, the benzodiazepinic drugs, which are still very popular, very, very popular. But as you know, they're super addictive. So they are not like, I don't know, clonazepam, for example, which is a very common benzo that is given to anxiety. And like the amount of, oh my God, the amount of prescriptions during COVID of benzos again, you know, it just skyrocketed everywhere. Here, in fact, the antidepressive sertraline, which is the most common, it was out of stock during COVID. This is how much it was being prescribed. And for it, in the budget for talking therapies, down. So you have the benzos and they feel really heavy. You get addicted, you need more and more and more. They stopped having an effect. There's lots of side effects. The first antidepressants from the 50s, the kind of housewives antidepressants that women were given because their nerves were too much, they made you feel horrible, you know, heavy. The benzos were addictive and made you feel unwell too. But then there is the invention after the DSM-3 of the perfect drug. So you have the category depression now that is being, you know, you're not well, you're depressed. And then you have the drugs for it because again, you need to pass approval for your drug, and you have to say what it is for. And it's so interesting that when the drug companies started creating these other drugs that now are very popular, they're called SSRIs. So they are serotonin inhibitors. They create a narrative about what causes depression. And it's really interesting because in the UK today, there's such a massive discussion about this, and it's really radical, and we should all be thinking about it. I'll speak about that in a minute. These drug companies, when they are looking for approval for their drugs to kind of license them for all these different types of depression that one could have, like and also then later for all the types of anxieties, they also hire a lot of PR firms. Those PR firms, they create patient groups, like to ask for, and also in the US, you have, you can advertise psychiatric drugs on TV. And then you have these like crazy ads, like in the 90s, like imagine being allergic to people, Paxil, this crazy ads on television. And this promise that all you need is this drug and your life is going to be sorted. So all of that goes together through especially the 90s. And what happens is that we have this super medicalized society, and it just becomes worse and worse. These drugs, these SSRIs, which are still the mainstream drugs for depression and anxiety, they were famous because they were not heavy on you. They had no side effects. They were safe. That's how they were marketed. And only now, last year, I think, or the year before, that here in the UK, the NICE guidelines started listening to the colleagues that want to deprescribe. Only this year, a manual of deprescribing antidepressants has been issued independently. And there is a psychiatrist who's, she's really famous here in the UK. Her name is Joanna Moncrief. She and a group of others, they're very polemic because they're psychiatrists that are anti-psychiatry, but not coming from politics like us, coming from psychiatry. And she actually conducted this huge study last year looking at all the studies about the serotonin paradigm for depression, because that's what people were told, that you're depressed because there's something missing in your brain. And here you're going to regulate this and you're going to be good. This group of colleagues, they actually looked at all these studies and they said that this makes no sense. And there's no proof. And as you know, for mental health related things, it's very difficult to find proof. There's very little evidence for anything. Even the age-old question of madness, which, schizophrenia, we don't know what causes it, why, we don't know. There's lots of billion-dollar studies, genetics, all sorts, but there's no conclusion. It's a gray zone. So all of this is to think about perhaps the landscape, the current psychopolitical landscape. So you have this American paradigm. And by the way, the DSM is mostly funded by private pharma. A lot of the researchers, they get money. And this is, when you start studying these things, it feels a bit conspiracy-like. You start thinking, oh my God, am I, like, what is this? But it's actually really shocking and interesting too. So to kind of map it all again, if you try and think about anxiety as this thing that most of us experience, that a fifth of the population experiences it in a way that is too much and not normal, there's very little space to think about why and what does it mean and what is it doing and why are you anxious? What is that a reaction for? Let alone if it could mobilize something else. So this is the scenarios that we are working with. Now moving on to the theory of it. How can we think about it, I found it useful, and this is one way of thinking about it. So when we're looking at the psychopolitics, there's so many scholars that think about it from the perspective of the humanities and social sciences. and you can use all sorts of theoretical underpinnings. But I found very useful to think of this one little text by Deleuze that maybe some of you know. It's called The Postscripts on Societies of Control. It's this tiny 5 pages long text. It's one of my favorite of his texts, which is, it's difficult to have a favorite. But it's interesting because there he situates his concept of the individual instead of the individual. This idea of this cell that cannot be divided is the one that can be divided. And he links that with the forms of control that he was able to map then. I found that theoretically interesting to situate the psychopolitical landscape, because what I saw is this individualizing practice, something that fragments you into control. And if you look at how, when you work in the clinic, if you work with younger people nowadays too, most of them, they want that label. And sometimes they want that medication. It's not that we are working with a scenario that is the same paradigm of the pre-psychiatric reform, when people were cast as mad, they hated it because it just ended their lives socially, it stripped them off from their citizenship. It's a very different situation. What you see is people coming to you for care, wanting a label. I used to work at an arts university before I worked at Essex, and I had a lot of American students too, no offense. And when you're teaching a class and you share this oh, is there anything that the teacher should know about you, about what you're expecting from this module? And the number of students, and they were about 19, 20-year-olds in art school, the number of students that would put something psychopathological there was impressive, and it would just grow and grow and grow. And I was always curious about that. What is this doing? It serves a function for them. Something is really unbearable, and saying this about them, I have this, I need this, it gave them some space. And yet it limited their possibility of living their lives in excess of themselves, and just, allows us to kind of strengthen this wall of what you can deal with and you cannot deal with. In fact, to digress a little bit, if you look at some of the, not many, but there's some scientific studies about psychoanalysis in relation to CBT and medication and anxiety and depression. And the Tavistock conducted a big study some years ago, which I think is really cool. It's difficult to get psychoanalysts to agree to stuff like that. But it has an important function. And what you see is that people that are medicated or offered just CBT, a lot of the times they relapse because you're not going to the root, you're just trying to displace. And what happens is that you're trying to protect yourself from any affective excess. So if you find yourself in a situation that anxiety as a response to a threat to your integrity comes up again, you have less and less conditions of dealing with it. There's a question in the chat. And there are you. Oh, cool. This is a really cool question. Let's maybe I'll invite you to talk in a minute. When I finish, that sounds really good. So I thought a lot about this idea of the individual, and what I kind of worked with theoretically was to think, okay, we can be estranged from our anxiety, or we could try and think about an experience of entanglement. Can we be entangled with our affects? And of course, if we think about affective entanglements, we are thinking about a political utopia that is very different from mainstream psychiatry and from mainstream psychoanalysis too. This idea of entanglement of affects invites us to think about an ecological, feminist, anti-colonial landscape of possibilities of existing. How can I experience life with others in the world and not think about experience as alienated, disentangle as alienated, and this paradigm of the individual that alienates and alienates, and the individual of consciousness, and even worse, to think about this ideas of the possibilities of living together only through consciousness, that as if ethical probity is only guaranteed through consciousness of the self. But can there be ways of living together that are ethical and depart from affective excesses? So this is the rabbit hole of the philosophical anchor of my work. So you have this kind of medical humanities reality, and then I try to figure that out. Yeah, I won't go too much through it because I want to hear you all. But I then started thinking, okay, I can't think about this so abstractly alone. So I invited the work of art of a Brazilian artist called Lygia Clark. I don't know if you know her. She's really cool. And she had this text at the end of her life, and she devised this pretty bizarre practice when she was at the end of her practice, which she called structuring of the self, that she would meet people at home for sessions like a few times a week, 1 hour, and she would use these things that she called relational objects to produce sensations, and the sensations then would produce words. And it's interesting that in her thinking, something would happen in that togetherness, but something would really happen when the person actually left the session. It's by having a different sensation that is only kind of zipped because of someone else that you're able to encounter the world differently. And I find that very beautiful. And I find that a paradigm for the psychoanalytic clinic that is non-hegemonic. It's about really a transformation of your possibilities of living in the world beyond what you already know, beyond the words that you already have, but most importantly, beyond the repertoire of the analysts themselves, beyond this idea of interpretation. Or you go there and the analyst says, okay, this is what is happening. So I proposed in this work, and people could propose all sorts of words, the concept of vibration, which I rescued from this artist and from Deleuze and Guattari as a working concept, in the very Deleuzean sense, as a concept that you invent, that you bring to life. And I created the funky genealogy of it. I went through every single moment that Deleuze and Guattari mentioned it. This kind of weird cartographic genealogies that is not about the truth, but it's about going on a trip with your author to see how does it vibrate? How does vibration vibrate? And what was interesting is that, to me, that was helpful to think about the clinic, because sometimes in a post like Deleuze and Guattari scholarship, especially the ones that are still a bit patriarchal, there's this idea of pure immanence and something that never ends, that sometimes it kind of stinks of some omnipotent potency of affect, which is so different, like you have accelerationism and stuff like that, which is so far away. And even some texts about affects that are a bit dodgy, there's lots out there. But it's so far from their ecological, anti-capitalist, disalienating commitment, and feminist commitment too, even though they weren't so clear sometimes. So vibration, for me, it allowed me to think about the matrix of power. So yeah, I don't want to think with Oedipus. I don't think Oedipus is all. And yet, if we live in a patriarchal society, something of patriarchy shapes us too. Yeah, you're anti-racist, but racism shapes you too. So you're still within the matrix of power, but you're beyond the dialectic relation, because that's not all there is. In true Deleuzean and Guattarian sense, yes, you acknowledge the effects of that. You don't ignore it, and that's so important. That's the feminist twist, I think, of being like a feminist Deleuzean. There are material and subjective effects of the matrix of power. So when you name something anxiety, what happens? In the DSM. But my response to power is not all there is. I don't only exist in relation to that. And it's not only in relation to the big other in Lacanian terms. There's something that exceeds that too. And feminist post-Deleuzeans, especially Rosi Braidotti, who is a philosopher from Italy that I worked with a lot in my work, allows you to think about that. you know, to think about power and beyond power all the time. So to think about being and becoming, but never just becoming, as if, yeah, as if there's no material consequences of power, you know, as if I'm immune and not precarious. So I tried to think about then in the end of this work about a possibility of the clinic of anxiety in relation to this, so an entangled feminist clinic of anxiety. And that is to think, okay, it's not about only working with what it's saying, it's about doing that too in the clinic. But how can we mobilize that excess in that encounter in a way that we can't do on our own into something else? And to do that, we have to get out of a lot of psychoanalytic frames. And those are the moments that I call the vibrational moments in psychoanalysis, when Freud and Lacan weren't being Oedipal, when there was something about excess that was not inscribed in something that could be interpreted with something that already existed, and yet you could work with. And where I got was this idea of co-poiesis. Poiesis, the producing something new. And I think it's really beautiful too, because it's the production of something, but it's also the poetics of something. You know, there's this aesthetic production of something, and by doing it together. And that was the end of kind of the work proposing this method of copoiesis, which is working with rupture, with that which doesn't fit, as opening words in the clinical encounter. And of course, this is not like a solution for all anxious problems of the world, but it was just one intervention that has helped me a lot ever since. You know, it really transformed my practice. It gave me something to hold on to when I'm there with people. And a lot of the people that come to us in different spaces of care, they've tried everything, you know, they're not there just for fun, because it doesn't feel good to feel so panicky and anxious. But what I think is interesting, I think, in this idea of copoiesis, which Guattari kind of flirts with, Rosie Braidotti flirts with, Donna Haraway flirts with, you know, it's like this lost idea, and I try to bring it all together too. I think it allows us to see the clinical encounter as this kind of micro political laboratory, where it is possible to be in a different place. So me and Stephen are here, and let's say if you're my analyst today and I'm your analysand, we're not in the same place. There is a mutuality, but it's not about being the same. And it's not about trying to be the same through identification. You don't have to know my experience. It's not about that kind of empathy, you know, which is a lot of therapeutic language is on that, this intersubjectivity that is based on sameness. It's about difference, also the different of positions. But it's a difference that doesn't rely on a power dynamic. And you're not interpreting, you don't know, but we are doing something together. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to keep on thinking, the idea of the commons and this clinical paradigm. How is it possible for us to occupy different positions without reproducing power relations? You know, so stripping power relations doesn't have to be that we're all equal, because that is, I think it's a heterocolonial delirium of equality, but it's not equality that is, you know, to work with the paradigm of difference, which is very Deleuze again. And yeah, and again, maybe some colleagues that are here in the room today, to think about this clinical laboratory beyond the clinic itself. And I think a lot of colleagues are trying to do that. And if you think about the critical and the clinical again, how can this clinical paradigm be expanded from the clinical encounter to? So there's lots there to think about the commons. And if we want to establish possibilities of togetherness and the relation of what works. So that's a very long and yet brief, I don't know, summary of all the work in the book. We'll put the link there for you if you're, yeah, it's free. It's there. It was my PhD, so it's all it is. You know, it's just a piece of research. And I hope you took something from it, and if you read, there's something there for you. And now I would love to hear from you and your thoughts, your ideas, your work. Yeah, that would be great. I think some points in the chat from cool people. Yeah, feel free to come in. You can just like raise your hand and just talk. That would be great. Yeah, there's lots of great messages there. Cool. Who wants to talk? There was this person that had that point. Yeah, John, come in, please.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Here, I'll turn my camera. Let's see if this works.
Yeah, let us see you. You can.
Good. Okay, hi. So I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm a musicologist. So I certainly don't do any of these things. But being, let's say, of the younger generation, of the generation where people are tending to, okay, so these will be very informal language because I'm not entirely sure how to explain it higher,
Almost
but
better. Go for it.
so being of the generation where it seems as though is how do you put this politically nicely? Everyone seems to be inclined to adopt some sort of self-diagnosed psychoanalytical sort of label without sort of the means to, let's say, objectively test whether they actually have it or not. So I thought it was very interesting, the sort of the verifiable say symptoms of these labels don't really matter. It's the personal experience that matters more than the labels do. And I think that's rather dangerous. But from the psychoanalytical part, I know more about sort of the capital, the layers of capital. So I was thinking, I mean, it's sort of observable that having some sort of self-diagnosis, even on platforms like TikTok, are popular, that they carry some sort of social capital, and then you have some sort of, from cultural studies or maybe sociology, you have a ticket to different social circles. You have now been granted, whether legitimately or not, a ticket to participate in a culture that you couldn't have before. And to me, that sort of sounds like distracting from what you said, using, how do you say it? Using anxiety and its sort of satellite conditions as a way to sort of probe underneath the surface of why you're anxious. Okay, I think I have PTSD, but why? And so it's the why question that I feel like the labels don't really engender very much. So I just curious what your thoughts are on this. Is that anxiety may be a ticket to something deeper, but not if the person themselves don't see it that way. And that if the label is actually more beneficial than trying to, let's say, reunify the self and get rid of the label. So then how do you work against that? If the label has now become attractive within the sort of, yeah, the social paradigm, how do you
Totally
work
so.
against?
This is such a good intervention. You're so right. I worked a little bit on this question in one of my chapters, and this idea of the individual really helped, because if you go to that text, this is exactly what becomes evident. Yes, you get a password by being divided in that way. There was this book that I used a lot when I was writing it. Now it's about 10 years old, but it's by a sociologist from Goldsmiths called Will Davies.
The happiness industry?
The Happiness Industry. It's such a good book about this. I mean, it's not about TikTok, but he talks a lot about the quantified self movement. So how we use like apps and things to measure our well-being. And he makes a similar kind of sociological critique to that. This paradigm of identity and identification, and this idea that there is an I that is coherent, is the promise, right? I have BPD. I am ADHD. I am. It gives some sort of sense of consistency in a world that perhaps people feel that inconsistency it's becoming unbearable for a variety of reasons. I think in the work itself, I think if you work in culture studies and other kinds of forms of expression, thinking about the question of identity and identification is key there, and to think about what's beyond prescribed identities and identifications. But in the work in the clinic, it's really subtle. It's really subtle. Usually when people come and say, I have this diagnosis, you try and start with them and think, okay, what does that mean to you? What do you mean? I know what it means in the book, but what does that mean to you? And little by little, I think that's my experience. When you're critical about it, it's not like you're gonna go, like, I don't know, like I'm speaking as a psychoanalyst now, not as just a scholar, but as a psychoanalyst, it's not like you go to a session of like political brainwash, you know. I have all these thoughts about those diagnoses and medications. When people come, you have to hear them out and see what's that about for them. And usually in my experience with a lot of labels, mostly after some work, there's in this work of togetherness, there is a capacity to live through some inconsistency, not as something that fragments you and makes you feel so unwell, but something that gives more room for you to breathe, to live a life otherwise, too, where things don't have to just fit, you know, and kind of get out of that fixity of experience. So I think to have, you know, I think it's about our ears and how we are attuned to this. Being critical of labels in that sense allows us to think, and then in your work together, there's room for questioning it. But yeah, absolutely, you're so right about the phenomenon of TikTok and diagnosis. It's real. It's real.
There's an interesting overlap there with the point you were making about the DSM-3 and how, in a kind of like STS way, the measure produces the effect rather than measuring the effect.
Totally. Yeah. Was it Lucas or Ariana? I don't know the order. Maybe I'll say Ariana and then Lucas.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, thanks very much. It was really wonderful. And I'm sorry I haven't read the book because I think it's so much food for thought. I will do that soon. Yeah, so my question is, and apologies if I don't use the right terms.
That's all right. Go on.
Yes, yeah, so I was wondering about the relationship between thinking of anxiety as a form of affective excess and different kinds of ameliorative models. So not cure, okay, whatever we want to call that. I was wondering whether this difference, so thinking of entanglements as opposed to some kind of complete and isolated individual, whether yeah, how it relates to amelioration as something that, yeah, so I think that's a question, and in particular, yeah, no, maybe that's my question. Thanks so much.
That's a really great question, Ariana. So if you go to, I worked with Freud and Lacan in detail in this research, not with others, but maybe that will be the same. And for both of them, in the different moments in their writings, there is a question of excess in anxiety. There's something that knocks at your experience of yourself that feels too much. And actually, anxiety comes as some sort of signal to a threat of disstability. And even though Freud will change his mind about, you know, the source and the movement there, that's pretty much the gist of it. The same goes for Lacan. Lacan will use another term. I didn't go into it now because, yeah, like, I don't know, I've exhausted the Lacanese, but I hate how he's always so useful. But Lacan has this other term, which he calls the real with capital R. And I love that he calls the real because it's like the real. It's not like reality as we think it is, but it's that reality that knocks and insists and is excessive and has no place in the repertoires that we have, both the ones that we share and the ones that we kind of bridge into the world in order to make sense of it. Something that invades, you know, something of the borders, something of the drives, something of this libidinal energy that just breaks in. And anxiety for Lacan is an eruption, an encounter with this real, with this eruption. And it's so interesting to think in that way. If we think about, and you use the word amelioration, which is so key, because we think about the wellness industry, right? And this not billion, but $1 trillion industry of Gwyneth Paltrow, candles, meditation, weight blankets, you name it. I mean, everything, wellness. Wellness is amelioration, is to get that excess soothed. And there is a repetition, and the repetition of that, it's usually about keeping the real outside of your reality even more. And my argument, it's something that psychoanalysts do all the time, and sometimes I hate, but you can't avoid, is if you go back to Freud, this is the point of it all, is to be able to live with this excess, is to be able to become more porous to the world. And in the research that I've done in the book, you see like that in the nitty-gritty. And then what I found most useful is that when Freud and Lacan, when they were not relying on the Oedipal metaphor, that's exactly the moment. So you have very early Freud, and then almost dead Freud, and then you have very late Lacan. Those are the 3 moments in which you have this excess as something that has got nothing to do with Oedipus, which means you're not inscribing the logic of sexual difference as heteropatriarchal binary sexual difference as necessary, and the consequent logic of lack and castration. It's not necessary for the theory of anxiety and for the theory of anything. But then there is this possibility in their theories, which it's when they're crazier, especially Lacan, the late texts, they are really nonsensical. And the pity is that he wasn't a feminist, because I think he was actually not that radical as we would like him to be. Not as radical as his theory, I guess. But if Lacan was in dialogue with the feminists of his time, then that would have been pretty interesting, because it's exactly that. He abandons the Oedipal metaphor. He abandons a lot of the structuralist kind of addictions he had until the 60s. And there is a scope to think about mobilizing excess into experience. And it's really beautiful. So you have that theoretically, and you have that in the clinic itself. That's kind of what you do, isn't it? Trying and find a way to live with excess, so there could be something else for life. And you know what? It becomes more bearable. So if you think about amelioration, not as an amelioration of the logic of the medicine or CBT that quiets things down. It's not about stop being anxious. Think again, stop being anxious, and bing, have the pill. No, by working through it, the function of this, and working through the excesses of yourself, by being in contact with that, it stops being so catastrophic and unbearable in most cases. Yeah, so it's interesting that it's also not just a theoretical philosophical exercise. Actually, in the clinic of anxiety, it's very potent too. I hope that makes some sense, Ariana, but thanks for your question. It's really great. And Lucas.
Hello. Thank you for
Hello.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation, and also very clear. I mean, in a way that it's very well explained and elaborated, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And it's because Lacan is gonna say that anxiety is the affect, so it doesn't produce representations, and in a certain way we see a very good connection to Guattari, even more than to Deleuze. But then on seminar 10, that is the seminar on anxiety, he pretty much elaborates it on the relationship with the alienation in language. So we would meet this Rio from object A, but then there's always language that you have to do something with this relationship inside of the relation with the big other and the master signifier. So he gets more conservative. But then you were just mentioning that the late Lacan on seminar 20, he's going to talk about la langue, and la langue is this potency of creation. And then there is Guattari and Deleuze, they're going to talk about affects and percepts. And if you can, I don't know, talk a little bit about that, because I think affects and percepts are so important here in the clinic, but we don't talk as much. And if you can just, I don't know, anything that comes to mind.
That's really beautiful. I think you've said it all, first of all, because yes, you're so right. The seminar 10 on anxiety, I worked so much in that seminar and it makes no sense. And I hope I gave people like a nice little summary, but from a feminist perspective. And it's exactly that. It's the Lacan that is trying to kind of get over himself, but he still cannot, you know, it's still, there's something very structuralist there. About structuralist when we say that there is a repertoire of possibilities that is prescribed, you know, this is as simple as that. If we want to just kind of dissect what it means, not just as a school of thought, but as an approach to ideas and the politics of ideas. Yeah, he talks in Seminar Terra about anxiety being the lack of lack. So when you're not in this experience of somebody that can do, it's, yeah. What I think is that towards the end, when Freud at the beginning is talking about libidinal flows and energy and doesn't have anything to do with Oedipus. So again, no prescribed structure for relationality and desire, no zones of the body, nothing of that. When Freud is at the beginning saying that kind of stuff, already at the end, when he has this passage, and I kind of milked it a little bit, and it's on the outline for psychoanalysis from 1938, and he talks about the id having a system of perception on its own. And when I read that, I was like, yes, Freud at the very end, he's like, okay, there's something about the unconscious that has a system of perception of its own. Bingo. Yes, he knew it. And yes, like what is not conscious is also in the world, you know, it's not just a reservoir of something of the drive. The drive is not a body that is isolated from the world, and that is in the theory of the drives anyway. Guattari goes back to early Freud, but there's very little dialogue between late Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari. As you know, there's lots of speculation, and I think we have here in the room some specialists on that kind of time. It's well known that Lacan was very jealous of Guattari's ideas and developments with Deleuze and not willing to cite anything and be in dialogue, which, you know, is a pity for him because it seems that Guattari didn't care a thing. Yes, La Langue, it's something about the materiality of language beyond signification. And it's exactly what Lygia Clark, this artist that I worked with, was going on about. There's something about the body, there's something about early experiences of the bodily and language, and also language is something that comes from the body, that don't have to mean something, and therefore have a meaning that is inscribed in this theory of language that it's based on Lacan. It's a phallic theory of language, the one that Lacan works with, right? Whilst Guattari is going to work with a different theory of language, the ones that allows for polyvocity. Meaning is multiple, you know, already. And that has a big clinical impact, I think, for us all. Especially, I don't know, I started working with psychosis, and I think some people start working with kids, and I think that's such a gift when you start working with people that are not just in that kind of adult neurosis, because you have to think better as a psychoanalyst, usually better than we were taught, you know? So I think there's something about that, the polyvocity and the materiality of language that is in late Lacan. It is definitely in Deleuze and Guattari. It's not exactly in Freud, but maybe we could trace that. And yeah, I don't know. I agree with you. That's my answer. Really, really good points. And if that's something that you write on and you research, I'll be super keen to also read. What are you working on?
Is La Langue the kind of grass in Southeast Asia, or is it something?
I don't know.
Sorry.
I don't know, but that's what question?
How do you spell it?
La Langue is like the language, and it's also something that he goes on. It's like it's a neologism. It doesn't mean anything, but it's like for Lacan is this like baby language, you know, that we have, like the sound and these words that babies and little kids have, and it's not about the symbolic system of language.
Okay.
And yet, it's something that you can work with, and you have some, yeah. I think there's a lot of fetishization of this late Lacan moment when you're finally gonna get to work with the unconscious proper. But I think it's more simple than that, isn't it? In practice, it's about us being able to listen better, perhaps. Yeah. Do you have any comments? It doesn't have to be anything to do with my presentation, just like whatever
Well,
sparks joy.
I'm thinking here, thank you, Marie Kondo. I'm thinking here about commons again, and thinking about okay, oftentimes the kind of situations which provoke anxiety in a negative sense are things which we can't control, like our jobs or the things around us. But thinking again about copoesis, is it you would always go to like ergotherapy, the way Tuscany organizes it, saying you're not going to deal with this by an individual thing. You're going to make things together. You're going to make a cafe. You're going to make an arts workshop. And the collective process is when you work things out rather than through, you know, your thing. It's,
Totally.
but then it makes me wonder if we're experiencing a lot of anxiety, economic conditions, for instance, at which point does forms of collective work or co-production become therapeutic?
Mm.
And almost like is it a question of rather than addressing anxieties or other affects as individualized things, address them as how to respond to them collectively through things done together.
Yeah, totally. I think it's spot on. And Freud actually had something to say about that.
Oh.
You know, Freud, as some of you know, he'll give anxiety, different types of anxiety, different names all around his work. But he has this moment that he calls it realistic anxiety, and moral anxiety, and castration anxiety, and separation anxiety. But realistic or neurotic anxiety. And to me, that's really helpful in the clinic. Also, if you think about the clinic as a political space, when you get people anxious or feeling unwell because of political suffering, it's really important to politicize then that. And there is a process of recognition of that world existing. I don't know, like after, like in October, November last year, I have quite a lot of Arab patients, especially LGBT Arab patients, that some of them are actually in the Middle East. And of course, they brought an amount of anxiety that was overwhelming. But it's important to recognize that as a realistic anxiety. And it's not that you're going to say it's a realistic anxiety to them necessarily, but to treat that as non-neurotic. It's not the person that is having this difficulty being beyond themselves. It's something of the world that is crushing. And perhaps there's something really healthy about reacting to that in a way that is not immune to, but you can recognize what is actually happening. That is.
But then could you also say that sometimes amelioration isn't necessarily a bad thing, but a very necessary thing?
Yeah,
And you have,
totally.
you have to distinguish when you're ameliorating as a result of a realistic anxiety, because you can't actually address the underlying thing quite yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes then it's for me is to think about this idea of a threat to yourself. And if there's any consistency with any form of anchoring, which is a term that I borrow from an analyst from Brazil, any type of anchoring that you can work with when life is so precarious. Usually to listen to that, somebody that is being displaced, that is in a financial difficulty, is there anything that can be anchoring for that subject? And you work with that, recognizing the reality of facts. This is a very political ear, and a lot of psychoanalysts work like that too. But the hegemonic mainstream psychoanalysis does not. And in fact, there is a tendency, especially in the British school, to really think about only internal objects and fantasies. So you really take politics out of the picture, which I think it's a repetition of violence, of a huge kind of violence that you can be doing to people, right?
I'm thinking here about the way that the Black Panthers talk about the idea of survival pending revolution. There's certain things you do to survive now, and then eventually you work to get somewhere else.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore the things you have to do now in order to get there later.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And the thing that you mentioned about SKAs and ergotherapy and the togetherness, I think it's always the conclusion, isn't it? That you can't do it alone. And that's why I think about the clinical encounter as an encounter. Whatever frame, whatever way that happened, but it's an encounter. There's something clinical about encountering, forms of encountering that produce the commons. Do you see? It's not just any encounter. It's not an encounter of identification, of repetition, but if it produces the common, So something that is together in difference, there's something clinical in that encounter. Yeah, I would agree with that you can't do it alone. And it's really crazy because now one of the things that is being offered to people and it's growing is this kind of AI chatbot therapies, right? For depression and anxiety, which then there you go. This is exactly what you don't have as an encounter. You have AI.
To me, the encounter with the chatbot counselor sounds like the moment of encountering the real in a very harsh sense.
Yeah. Who's real? Who's real? Who's big tech real? Any other comment or free associations? People want to maybe talk about their work or about anything else? Thanks for the messages. Yeah, really great points on the whys there from some colleagues. Thanks so much for your comments. Art therapy, that's so cool. I'll go for that. That's a really cool point. I didn't really think about that in this work myself. And yeah, I agree that after I came up with not came up, I didn't come up with it, I borrowed. But after I started thinking about vibration, I could not stop seeing it everywhere, and usually in some pretty kind of neo-hippie kind of spaces. I think it's not my field of research necessarily, but I think it's there in the sense that you can have and you know, the agencement, the mobilization, the assembling of excessive affects through collectivity in so many ways of living together, so many rituals, so many things across different cosmologies, you know. I think, yeah, I haven't dedicated myself to that, but I think it's, do you know, I think when you work as a post-human feminist from the beginning, it's so much easier to decolonize your thought than when you work as a Hegelian thinker. And as a feminist, for example, of course, I was taught in like the UK, and then you have a lot of like gender theory, especially Anglophone gender theory, which is colonial in the true sense of imagination. You know, you have the division between nature and culture. And then you have a big problem when you want to decolonize all sorts of practices of togetherness. You have to patch up your theories over and over, you know, band-aid here, band-aid that, but. And I think when you're a post-human feminist, when you think about materiality and plurality from the beginning in that way, which I think it's something that the thought of Deleuze and Guattari has been fundamental to me, to think in that way. You don't think about the culture-nature continuum in this post-enlightenment delirium. So it's much easier to think about these concepts outside of this Western practice. It's not what I'm claiming to do, but I think this dialogue would be easy, you know, as long as we recognize also that psychoanalysis is not the place, is not the owner of anything unconscious necessarily, is one way, you know, and within the clinics of Psy, it's one of the ways that I think it's the best so far from what's available and offered to people. But in no way you think that that's something that is so unique, you know, and yeah, you're right. I think there's lots of practices of effective assembling together that operate on that level in different places in the world. Yeah.
I mean, an interesting way to go in that direction, and maybe I'm thinking because I just started reading it, is if you read something like Angela Melitopoulos's on PhD, where she's talking about machinic animism and drawing on the work she did with Lazzarato and the work of I always get his name wrong, Eduardo de Castro,
Vivero de Castro,
the
yeah.
the multi-perspectivism stuff.
Yeah,
And
that's really good, you guys. I don't know if you've seen it. This is an artist called Angela Militopoulos who did a practice-based PhD at Goldsmiths, and she her thesis is online for free, and she did this piece on like institutional psychotherapy, and it's amazing. There's a film that I've never watched, but the thesis is online. It's I think 60 pages only, and it's really amazing stuff. So if you just Google it, Angela Militopoulos PhD, you will find it, and that's what Stephen is referencing to. Yes, I think this kind of yeah, this kind of materialist thinking already allows us to think about nature and affects and culture in a very different way than what's been inscribed by this structuralist or post-illuminist directions in philosophy that have, you know, of course, framed psychoanalytic theories so much. I don't know if I'm making any more sense anymore. Thank you for your comments. Creating commons need a method. Well, Raluca Soriano, that is a very good question. Do creating commons need a method? And if so, what can psychoanalysis bring to such a method? I think there could be a method of creating commons that we could experiment with, as long as that is a precarious method, you know, like a ritual that is created through its ongoingness. Because I think there's something about psychoanalysis that is just like that too. You know, when you have a patient and they will figure out how to use that space. Especially again, if you work with kids or in the clinic of psychosis, they will figure out how to work with that space. And you have to work with that and adapt and be creative and do it together, rather than impose a frame and think that that frame holds some ritual that is necessary about the dispositif, you know? So I think to create a commons, yeah, we could mimic a lot of psychoanalytic experimentations. And I think historically we have a lot of that. A lot of that. One of my big interests in life is the Italian feminists, how they worked with psychoanalysis in the 70s and 80s. And I hope to do some research on that one day, maybe. But they had these groups of practice of the unconscious, which I love that emerged after the groups of consciousness raising. So the first gen, like 70s feminists, they were like wanting to raise consciousness. And they're like, yeah, raising consciousness. And like, actually, it's about raising unconsciousness. You know, you have to practice unconsciousness because consciousness, it takes us here. So I think that's a way of creating the commons through psychoanalytic ideas that already happened in the 70s. Unfortunately, not so inscribed in our feminist imagination, not translated even. But I think the work that we do, Raluca, on free clinics, it's exactly what we are seeing. You know, a lot of the collectives, not all, and I think this is the key, the collectives that try to think about their collectivity and create rituals to work with what doesn't fit and with ambivalences and excesses. That's something that we psychoanalysis can really bring to the commons, because that really kind of takes the naive idea that putting lots of people together, you can be together and it's so easy, because it's not, as we know, it's very hard.
The way I would think about it is oftentimes when we're talking about how to build commons, we're talking about that as very practical organizational questions, and neglecting that we're also talking about ways of structuring desire and engaging with the structuring of desire. So almost like bringing that dynamic back into it rather than just pretending it's not there.
Totally. I sign under this. Very good. Yeah, very good. Thanks to everyone that has shared comments. I'll put a link to the book. Maybe let's Do you want to Google it? Here's your computer. And then share a link?
Yeah, I'll do that. One thing
Sorry.
which people could hear that probably can't is the way that Santina is gently snoring as you're talking.
And here's my dog who's here with us. Oh, no. Sorry, she wants to say hello. Oh, yeah, she's north.
Cool. I will. Is the best link the
I think the Springer link.
Springer one? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So you can download it or read it online. And it's open access through the generosity of the University of Essex, UK.
Yay! Cool.
And yeah, if you have any work that is in dialogue with it in any way and wants to share, please get in touch. And I'll be super keen to read it and speak further. And even though this is something that I've done, of course, a few years ago, as it is when you do a PhD and then you publish a book later, sometimes it feels like another life. But there's so much of it, especially this point of the commons and togetherness. That is what's in the work that we are doing now at Essex at Free Psy with Raluca, who's here, and some other colleagues.
Well,
That's something that I'm still keen to think about.
It's kind of like when Deleuze says that philosophers get 3 problems in their life. When you do a project, this project stays with you, even if you're finished with it, you keep getting.
Totally. Or like my PhD examiner said, Rosie Bardot, she said, Anna, we only have one good idea in our lives.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks so much, colleagues, old and new. I'm so pleased that you were here. Thanks for listening. It was really helpful for me to talk loads and go back to those ideas. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to hear you and see you, and I hope to see you soon.